In the early 1970s, South Wales, a region known more for its coal mines and steelworks than for violent crime, was gripped by fear and confusion. Over the course of a few months in 1973, three 16-year-old girls were brutally murdered in what would become the largest manhunt in Welsh history and a landmark case in forensic science. The perpetrator would be known infamously as the Saturday Night Strangler. The first victim was Sandra Newton, a 16-year-old girl from the nearby town of Britton Ferry. On a July night in 1973, Sandra had been out with her boyfriend and was walking the 5-mile route home around 1 a.m. When she failed to arrive, the community grew worried. 2 days later, her body was discovered near a coal mine in Tanmar, dumped in a ditch at the entrance of a culvert. The crime scene was chillingly careless. Little effort had been made to hide the body. Sandra had been indecently assaulted, struck on the head, and strangled with her own skirt. Police suspected that she had tried to hitchhike her way home and believed the killer was local, possessing detailed knowledge of the remote dumping site. Only 2 months later, in September, two best friends, Geraldine Hughes and Pauline Floyd, both age 16, vanished after a night out in Swansea. They too had been hitchhiking their way home. Their bodies were found in woodland near Landry, only 7 miles from where Sandra's body had been discovered. The girls had suffered the same brutal fate: indecent assault, beatings, and strangulation. The investigation revealed a haunting detail. One of the girls had attempted to escape, making it yards from the road near her father's workplace, but was caught and killed by the attacker. These horrific crimes plunged South Wales into terror. Brutal attacks on young teenage girls were almost unheard of in the area, and the fact that the perpetrator was still at large created a climate of fear and desperation. The community mourned, and the police launched what became the largest manhunt in Welsh history. A task force of 150 officers interviewed 35,000 people who fit the rough description of the suspect: a man in his early 30s with bushy hair and a mustache, driving a light-colored Morris 1100. Witnesses recalled seeing the girls leave Swansea that night, entering a car driven by a man matching that description. But despite the enormity of the investigation and the painstaking efforts of law enforcement, no arrests were made. Fear grew that the killer might never be caught. From the start, police believed the same man was responsible for all 3 murders. However, the investigation was complicated by the fact that Sandra Newton's case was treated separately from that of Geraldine and Pauline. Sandra's boyfriend, who was the last person seen with her, became the prime suspect in her death. Yet, he consistently maintained his innocence and was never charged. Decades passed, and the case went cold. Then, in the early 2000s, South Wales Police reopened the files as part of Operation Magnum, an initiative to apply emerging forensic science to cold cases. The key breakthrough came from advances in DNA technology. Forensic scientists isolated male DNA stains on Geraldine and Pauline's clothing, confirming that the same man was responsible for both murders. However, the DNA did not match anyone on the existing national database. A year into the investigation, a similar male DNA sample was found on Sandra Newton's underwear. Dr. Colin Dark, the forensic scientist leading the DNA work, described the moment vividly. "I recognized straight away from a particular feature of the DNA that this was the same perpetrator. This was an absolute bombshell because it proved a serial offender was operating in South Wales in 1973, ending the lives of young girls." This discovery exonerated Sandra's boyfriend once and for all. Detective Inspector Paul Bethel reflected on the moment. "For the first time in almost 30 years, we knew the same man had taken the lives of all 3 girls. Despite the DNA evidence, the perpetrator was not in the database. This forced the detectives to look for alternative ways to identify him. Inspired by the principle that DNA is inherited, Dr. Dark and his team pioneered a groundbreaking technique, now known as familial DNA profiling, searching for close relatives of the offender on the database to narrow down the suspect list. They painstakingly printed out thousands of DNA profiles from men in the South Wales area, manually crossing out those who didn't match. After hours of work, about 100 half matches remained, potentially children of the offender. Simultaneously, The police had whittled down their suspect pool from 35,000 to 500 based on witness descriptions, vehicle ownership, and previous violent offenses. Cross-referencing these lists led to one surname, Cappan. Paul Cappan, a local car thief, had DNA on the database due to his offenses, but he was only 7 years old in 1973. His father, Joseph William Cappan, however, was a very different story. Joseph Cappan, a bouncer and part-time bus driver on Port Talbot Sandfields Council estate, matched the physical description given by witnesses. He had a history of domestic violence and petty crimes, including assault and burglary, and was known in the community as a violent loner. Police had questioned him in 1973. He claimed his car was broken down on the night of the attacks, and his wife provided him with an alibi. Cappan was notorious for his aggressive behavior, including abusing his wife Christine Powell, whom he married in 1964. Christine later testified that Cappan assaulted her every 2 weeks and was responsible for killing the family dog in front of their son, Paul. His pattern of pursuing local teenage girls during his work as a nightclub bouncer and bus driver further solidified suspicions. In 1964, he had attempted to sexually assault a 15-year-old girl who managed to escape. A major obstacle confronted detectives. The prime suspect, Joseph Cappan, had died of lung cancer in 1990, aged just 48. To confirm their suspicions, the police sought DNA samples from Cappan's ex-wife and daughter, which provided 2/3 of his genetic profile. The match was strong but incomplete. The only way to be certain was to exhume Cappan's body. The first time in UK history a suspect would be exhumed for DNA proof of guilt. Permission was required from the highest level of government. Then Home Secretary Lord Blunkett approved the exhumation after weighing the evidence and the need for closure for the victims' families. In May 2002, at midnight under ominous skies, Cappan's coffin was exhumed. Dr. Dark recalled the moment. It was a horrible night, and just as we got to Cappan's coffin, there was a clap of thunder. It was as if evil had been identified. It sent shivers down my spine. DNA analysis at Swansea's Morrison Hospital confirmed what detectives had long suspected. Joseph William Cappan was the Saturday night strangler responsible for all 3 murders. Cappan was born in 1941 and grew up in a broken home, raised by his stepfather. From the age of 12, he attracted police attention for petty crimes and went on to rack up over 30 convictions, including car theft, burglary, and assault. His violent temper, criminal history, and tendency to prey on local teenage girls made him a perfect, albeit hidden, predator. Cappan is also suspected of a 4th attack in February 1976. His son, Paul's DNA, was key to identifying him posthumously, marking the first time a serial offender was identified through familial DNA profiling anywhere in the world, and the first documented serial killer in Welsh history. For the families of the victims, the breakthrough brought a mixture of relief and sorrow. Julie Begley, Geraldine Hughes's cousin, said, "No words can describe the way we all felt. It was a huge relief. None of us ever stopped hoping that one day we would find out who he was. Although you get on with your life, it never goes away." Geraldine was a fantastic girl. She was always full of fun. Sandra Newton's friend, Theresa May, shared, "I believe I will see her again, and we have got a lot of catching up to do. I have been going down to her grave for 49 years, and it is hard to believe she is there. My beautiful friend. She had her life taken away from her, her future taken away from her. I still think about her now. All these things that we could have and should have done together. But after all of those years, she can finally rest in peace now." The South Wales murders and Joseph William Cappan's identification marked a turning point in criminal investigations. The use of familial DNA profiling pioneered by Dr. Colin Dark's team became a revolutionary tool in solving cold cases worldwide, saving countless victims from the anonymity of unsolved crimes. Though justice came decades too late for Sandra, Geraldine, and Pauline, their stories and the relentless efforts of the police and forensic scientists changed the future of criminal investigations forever. The pioneering use of familial DNA profiling in their case set a new standard in forensic science, opening the door for countless cold cases to be revisited and solved. It demonstrated the power of perseverance, innovation, and collaboration between law enforcement and science, offering hope to families who had long suffered in silence. Most importantly, it ensured that Joseph William Cappen's reign of terror was finally ended in the eyes of the law, giving these young victims a measure of peace and a lasting legacy that no longer allowed their voices to be forgotten. Ricardo Burbano was 19 when his life ended in a senseless act of violence. In the early spring of 1992, he was still just a teenager, quiet, observant, living in Falls Church, Virginia. It was a peaceful suburb on the edge of Washington, D.C., a place where the city's chaos felt like something that always happened somewhere else. Ricardo had his routines, his small circle, and the kind of quiet presence that didn't draw attention but left a mark on those who knew him. In the last week of March, he left Falls Church for a visit to the city. It was the kind of trip people made all the time, quick, forgettable, harmless. A friend dropped him off at an apartment along Q Street NW in Washington, D.C., a neighborhood lined with row houses and noise, far from the quiet of where Ricardo came from. It was supposed to be a stop, not a final destination. His friend watched him go, never suspecting that those would be the last moments anyone would see Ricardo alive. The next day, on the 31st of March, officers in Prince George's County, Maryland, responded to a disturbing call in Hyattsville. Behind a property, in the kind of space people pass without thinking, they found a body. The man was unresponsive. EMTs confirmed what the scene already made clear. He had been dead for hours. The body was taken to Baltimore, to the office of the chief medical examiner. There, the autopsy didn't just confirm the death. It exposed the violence. Ricardo had been strangled. He'd been stabbed multiple times. There were cuts. There were signs of blunt force trauma. His death wasn't quick. It wasn't clean. It was rage-filled, prolonged, and deeply personal. This wasn't random. This was someone trying to silence him completely. Authorities soon identified him. It was Ricardo Burbano. The teenager who had vanished after being dropped off on Q Street was now the center of a homicide investigation that stretched across D.C. and Maryland. Detectives quickly connected the dots. The murder had taken place not in Hyattsville, where his body was found, but the night before, the 30th of March, inside the very apartment on Q Street where he'd last been seen. The home became the crime scene. Investigators worked quickly, gathering evidence, interviewing people who'd been around the apartment, trying to build a timeline. But despite the intensity of those early efforts, nothing stuck. Leads dried up, no arrests were made, and over time the case began to disappear from headlines, then from memory. It became one of many in a city struggling with a sharp rise in violence during the early 90s. The files were boxed up. Ricardo's name faded from public view, but he did not fade from his family. His death left a hole that never healed. The nature of it, the brutality, the lack of answers, the absence of justice, only deepened the wound. For years, his loved ones held on to the hope that someone, someday, would care enough to look again, that someone would speak, that science would catch up, that silence wouldn't be how this ended. And, eventually, they were right. In August 2022, a cold case team with the Metropolitan Police Department reopened Ricardo's file. The evidence had been preserved, and now, with advances in forensic technology, some of it could speak in ways it couldn't before. Bloodstains recovered from a carpet in the original crime scene, once just one more piece of a puzzle, now yielded a clear DNA match. It belonged to Ricardo. And the apartment where it was found had once belonged to a man named Ron Wright. Wright had since moved to Wimauma, Florida. 30 years had passed. But when the DNA came back, those 3 decades vanished in an instant. Investigators secured a warrant. Wright was arrested and extradited back to Washington, D.C., where he was formally charged with first-degree murder. The quiet teenager who had once stepped out of a friend's car and vanished into the city was now front-page news again. But it didn't stop there. Detectives continued reviewing the case. This time, they didn't stop after the first breakthrough. As they revisited the timeline and re-interviewed people connected to the case, another name emerged, Tyrone Long. At the time of the murder, Long had been a D.C. resident. His name had surfaced early in the original investigation, but nothing had ever come of it. Now, with fresh eyes and stronger context, investigators saw the links. The story was wider than a single suspect. It had been that way all along. On the 1st of April, 2025, Long was arrested under a D.C. Superior Court grand jury indictment. He was 54, the same age Ricardo would have been if he'd lived. United States Marshals located him, and he was taken into custody without incident. Another man now stood accused of helping end the life of a teenager who had never made it home. With both Ron Wright and Tyrone Long formally charged, the pieces finally began to fit. The case that had gone cold before it ever got warm had been given new life by persistence, science, and the refusal to let a young man's story stay buried. For Ricardo's family, the arrests couldn't bring him back, but they changed something. After 33 years of unanswered questions, someone was finally being held accountable. His case was no longer a blank space on a board of unsolved homicides. It had a name. It had suspects. It had closure, or something close to it. Ricardo Burbano's death was vicious, and it was forgotten by many. But it mattered, and thanks to those who refused to give up, it now sits where it always belonged, in the light. In the stillness of a Florida September, when the days were long and humid and the nights swelled with the sound of insects and far-off traffic, a quiet horror unfolded inside a modest home on East River Drive in Fort Myers. What happened behind its doors on the night of the 14th of September, 2011, would haunt two families for over a decade. Lisa Collins, just 21 years old, and Stephen Rios, 35, had their lives brutally stolen in a cold, calculated act of violence that defied explanation and left their loved ones reeling. The killers didn't just take lives, they left a silence so heavy it echoed through the years. For 2 full days, that house held its breath, undisturbed, untouched, until the 16th of September, when the absence of contact from Lisa and Stephen raised alarm bells. Family members, growing uneasy, decided to check on them. What they found inside the home was the kind of scene no one prepares for, something only seen in nightmares and crime shows. Stephen had been shot 3 times. Lisa, just a girl, barely out of adolescence, had been shot 8 times. The violence was staggering, the intent undeniable. This wasn't a robbery gone wrong or a spontaneous argument. It was an execution. Their loved ones, stunned and shattered, immediately called law enforcement. Officers arrived quickly, securing the home and beginning what would become a long, winding investigation, one that would stretch across years, span prison walls, and require a determined push from cold case detectives unwilling to let the case fade into obscurity. In the early days, investigators pored over the scene. They combed through the victims' pasts, searching for enemies, clues, anything that might explain who could have done this and why. But despite their efforts, the trail turned cold. Witnesses were tight-lipped. No one came forward. Time, the great eraser, began to sweep over the details, and eventually, the headlines disappeared. For over a decade, the case sat dormant, but not in the hearts of those left behind. Lisa's mother never stopped hoping. The pain never dulled. Every holiday, every birthday, every missed call was a wound reopened. Stephen's family clung to the belief that the truth would surface, that even if justice had gone quiet, it hadn't disappeared. In 2021, the silence finally cracked. Thanks to a renewed partnership between the Fort Myers Police Department Cold Case Unit and the 20th Judicial Circuit State Attorney's Office, the case was reopened. Together, these investigators began revisiting the evidence, rereading statements, retesting physical traces, and reevaluating details that had once seemed insignificant. And that's when a name began to resurface: Amy Carol Parks. A closer look at the events of the 14th of September, 2011 revealed that Amy had purchased a 9mm handgun, a weapon that ballistics would later confirm matched the one used to kill Lisa and Stephen. That detail, buried for years, became the domino that would bring the others down. On the 17th of August, 2021, Amy Parks was arrested. Her freedom, enjoyed for over a decade, came to an end. Charged in connection with the double homicide, she eventually entered a plea, guilty to burglary of a dwelling and accessory after the fact. Though she was not charged with pulling the trigger, her admission acknowledged her role in the events that led to the murders. Investigators believe she helped her husband, Michael Parks, gain access to the victim's home. In exchange for her cooperation and guilty plea, Amy received a 5-year prison sentence. But her conviction was just the beginning. As detectives pushed further, Michael Parks's name emerged again, and this time it stuck. Amy's testimony, along with newly corroborated evidence and witness accounts, helped authorities piece together a more complete narrative. Michael Parks, who was already serving time at the Okaloosa Correctional Institution in Crestview, Florida, for an unrelated offense, became the prime suspect. On the 27th of October, 2022, he was officially charged with the murders of Lisa Collins and Stephen Rios. His charges were extensive: 2 counts of second-degree murder with a firearm, 2 counts of third-degree felony, and 1 count of armed robbery causing death. Authorities believe that Michael Parks' motive was robbery, perhaps related to drugs, but the full reasons behind his cruelty remain largely unanswered. Even now, the why still echoes through the grief of the families who wonder what truly happened that night, behind the closed door of the East River Drive home. In October 2023, after a tense trial where Amy testified against her husband, Michael Parks was sentenced to 3 life sentences. No chance of parole, no more silence. For the families, the verdict brought a measure of closure, but not peace. How could it? Closure doesn't erase the years lost, the birthdays missed, the dreams cut short. But it does mean something. It means their fight wasn't in vain, that Lisa and Stephen weren't forgotten. The house on East River Drive still stands. To the neighbors, it may just be another home on another street. But to 2 families, and to the team of investigators who refuse to give up, it is a symbol of both horror and hope. A reminder that time can delay justice, but it cannot erase it. Lisa Collins was 21. She had a life waiting just beyond the corner. Stephen Rios was 35, with a future still in motion. They were loved. They mattered. And now, even after years of silence, their story ends with the truth.